Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our session today entitled Capital Improvements, a Blueprint for Success. Today's webinar is scheduled to go approximately 90 minutes, so we'll make sure that we keep everyone on time. And we'll be discussing how to manage the complexities of really planning, executing, and funding capital improvement projects. And of course, we'll weave in to the conversation some of our current circumstances with regard to the pandemic. And we're excited to bring those best practices today. My name is Bill Worrell, and I'm a director at First Service Residential. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. We do have a great group online, just so everybody knows. We've got community association leaders and board members and committee members. I also see a lot of property managers in the business, regional directors and vice presidents. And so really just a great round of the business from all leadership, management, and execution professionals. As you all know, we are relying heavily on these systems today, technology and bandwidth. Therefore, you may hear through the webinar from Eleanor or Janice. They are helping to administer this behind the scenes. If we do end up with a glitch, please be patient. We'll make sure to get this back online. In addition to, and at the same time, if you're taking notes, that's great. And please don't worry about, though, missing anything. We will publish the recording of today's session and provide that to you as well. So you'll be able to refer back to the information in the future. We do have a lot of wood to chop today. So let me jump right into our panelists today. I want to thank you all so much for attending and lending your time and experience and support as always. First, we have Henry Handler. Henry's the founding partner of Weiss Handler and Cornwell, PA. Henry, thanks so much for joining us today.
Bill, thank you very much for inviting me and in addressing these very important issues.
Excellent, and it's our pleasure. Next, from the finance side, John Lee. John's an industry professional, certainly vice president, very experienced, and he's vice president, of First Service Financial. John, thanks so much for attending.
Good morning, great to be here.
Greg Main Bailey is next. Greg is the executive managing director of development services at Colliers International. Greg is going to help support all things project and construction management. Greg, thanks so much. Great to see you again.
Thank you for having me. Good to be here.
Excellent. And with a decade or so of experience in property management on the front lines, we certainly have Michelle Pecci. Michelle's a regional director here with us at First Service Residential. And Michelle, it's great to see you. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, Bill. I'm glad to be here today.
Excellent. So as by way of introduction, again, we are focusing on capital improvement projects. These are a fact of life in every type of community association, whether this be a high-rise condominium, a garden-style community, a single-family home, low-density HOA, for example. We all have major capital improvement projects. We will be weaving into the conversation some of the discussions around preventative maintenance as well. How does that relate to capital improvement projects? But in every type of community, it's just a matter of time, depending on the age and the infrastructure of the community. Certainly how many storms you've withstood over the years since the community was built. Capital improvements are a fact of life for all of us, and we will focus on how to be successful in executing them for your community. Boards certainly understand how crucial they are and the complexities that they present as we've gone through that. And what we're going to do today is really endeavor to help simplify the process. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of planning up front. We're going to walk through all of that. And then finally, of course, weave into the conversation any impacts of COVID-19. We see every day these impacts, and how do we stage contractors, for example? Where can we do work? Where can we not do work? This is very, very property specific and project specific, but we will do our best to address those issues as well. And so therefore our agenda, we're going to begin with, capital improvements, really a definition of capital improvements versus preventative maintenance. We get a lot of questions about this in many board meetings. Understanding reserve studies. This is critical part of the platform. And so, one piece that we want to walk through and discuss to make sure that we have that in place as well as we're working through the project process. Will it be cash or credit, right, John? So today's environment, lending environment, we have all these different tools today, from lending to reserves to special assessments to operating budgets. John's going to help walk us through that. And of course, Henry's going to keep us within the guidelines from a legal perspective. And then, of course, the planning process. This is where the rubber meets the road. Without an effective executed planning process, it's going to be very, very difficult to be successful at the end of the day and closing out the project on time, within budget, and bringing real value to your community. So we're very excited about this agenda on capital improvements, and that's kind of a highlight of where we are. Now, as we work through capital improvements, Michelle, what I'd like to do, if we can get to slide 3 here, or 4, we're going to kick off with you to really, Michelle, if you can help set the stage and walk us through what those definitions are between capital improvement and preventative maintenance, your real life experiences on this, please.
Okay, thank you, Bill. So with capital improvement and preventative maintenance, essentially the capital improvement is going to be a project that is going to last typically 1 year. With preventative maintenance, it's going to be an ongoing maintenance item that you're going to be making arrangements for within your regular operating budget, and it's going to be done one time a year or more. With the cost of capital improvements is going to be anything $10,000 or greater. The preventative maintenance item is going to be, of course, anything less than $10,000 that's needed on a regular ongoing basis. With regards to funding for those projects, the reserve fund is usually used, and other funding sources if needed, for the capital improvement projects. And the preventative maintenance items are going to be coming out of your operational budget. And perhaps maybe Henry can weigh in a little bit on that, because I knew we have a lot of questions around that from boards on how do we fund these projects and what is the differences between both with regards to the law.
Well, thank you, Michelle. Capital improvements are a requirement in condominium association budgets, and it is optional in homeowner association budgets. The association is required in order to include as part of their budgeted item reserves for 3 component parts, but it may increase the number of items that are specifically addressed for and qualify for the definitions of capital improvement. The homeowner association statute allows for the continuation of reserves if commenced originally by the developer or contained originally in documents, or if inserted by membership vote. So there really is a commitment to having reserves budgeted in the condominium context and encouraged in the homeowner association context. Everything else is generally categorized as repair or maintenance. And so there's a clear distinction that the law attempts to make for these matters.
Yes, I agree. And that's a good highlight as we move into additional definitions. So a couple of good guidelines for everybody here: less than $10,000. Good benchmark to use, or greater than $10,000. And then where is it funded? From the reserve fund or from the operating budget, or other sources of funding that could be available that we'll dig into in a little bit. On the next slide, we talk about when maintenance can turn into a capital improvement. And this is, I think, important for us as a management team to really focus on where we're spending the association's budget. And when we're working with boards on where we are year to date with the budgets, it's very entirely possible that the cost of preventative maintenance for any single component in a community, could be a pump, it could be an HVAC, a piece of HVAC equipment, for example, that the constant repairs to keep that piece of equipment running really do, are bigger than the actual cost to replace, right? So we'll be looking at those business decisions and thinking about that. And we want to focus on that as well when we're looking at capital improvements. So maintenance can absolutely turn into a capital improvement project. And if replacing a component offers more advantages. And so we look at this from a sustainability standpoint, from that perspective, where it may make sense if the warranty's out of date, if the replacement of that piece of equipment helps to reduce utility consumptions, for example, and be more efficient for the community. Then you can start to look at that as perhaps a capital improvement project. Henry, anything to add on this piece of the slide?
I think it's important to remind the condominium association managers and directors, Bill, that there are 3 specified areas of budgeting for reserve accounts, and that is roof replacement, building painting, and pavement resurfacing. That is not the limits for which associations can create and maintain reserves, but it is a helpful guideline in terms of what homeowners associations should attempt to create by way of reserve obligations and reciting in the budget. So the Condominium Act gives us more guidance, gives us more specificity, but it is generally accepted as a guidepost for what to fund by way of reserve for homeowners associations.
Yeah, great advice. I agree. And it's something that each board and finance committee, for example, with their management team can look at. It's kind of a minimum requirement, right? But there's nothing to preclude the association from growing that list of items and equipment based on what's right for your community. So great point there. And Michelle, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit of a case study here. Greg will chime in at this time, but you recently went through a situation just like this, where preventative maintenance on the next slide did turn into a capital improvement project.
Yes, thank you, Bill. So we were fortunate to take over management services for a very large condo, a very large high rise. And what was first alarming in our initial inspections was the excessive number of roof tiles that were missing from each section of the roof. Upon further research, we also looked at the cost, any preventative maintenance plan that was in place. It was determined that there was no roof maintenance contract in place. The association was paying for the original installer to repair or replace those tiles and for extra tile to be on hand. As management, we immediately brought this to the board's attention, along with those costs that were associated with the repairs and maintenance of this item over a period of time prior to us getting there. What was determined was we made the recommendation to get a roof inspection because of the number of tiles that were missing. It was determined that there might be something larger going on there. The board approved the inspection for the roof, and of course it revealed there were bigger issues with the initial installation, which resulted in it becoming a capital improvement project and the entire roof tile system being replaced. So it's things like that over time, if those costs would have been reviewed, they probably would have determined, why are we paying so much for all of this? And maybe there's a bigger something at hand there that we need to take a deeper look at.
Yeah, Michelle, I wholeheartedly agree. I think the one point that needs to be made here is that if you defer preventative maintenance, or if you fail to do the maintenance, it is more than likely that that will turn out to be a major capital expenditure. So from that perspective, I cannot, from a project management and construction perspective, I cannot focus more on the fact that preventative maintenance is highly important and should not be deferred. One of the main reasons being that most of your capital items likely have warranties against them. And if those preventative maintenance procedures are not adequately followed, you stand to void your warranty and be in a lot more concerning financial position at a later date. The other things that need to be considered along that path are obviously implication the logistical implications of what you might be trying to accomplish on that roof, i.e. The HVAC system might need maintenance or repair. Is that contractor aware of the environment on the rooftop, what warranties are in place, how his work might affect the warranties on the roof, and so on and so forth. So really, no amount of due diligence is too much, and the preventative maintenance plan, maintaining those key assets on your property is going to be a large part of understanding what useful life is left and what the next steps are.
Yeah, I think it's a great case study. We've seen this before, and we bring these, what we find, to the board, but really paying attention to what are the warranties in place? Is there a preventative maintenance program in place? Because all of this has to do with the business decision at the end of the day to transition into a capital improvement project or not. So thank you very much both for that. Now we're gonna, I'll kick us off here on reserve studies. My perspective here is in Florida, of course, these are required, and Henry's gonna help define that for us, but it really is a planning tool and a budgeting tool. We see some communities that fund reserves. They may fund them 100%. They may partially fund them. Certainly your decision. And we see other communities completely waive reserves. And the way I look at that is if you have a good solid reserve study and it's up to date, you look at your funding and whatever shortfall there is, whether there's any funding at all or not, there will be a shortfall. That shortfall in that reserve study then becomes your special assessment schedule, right? So you know that in 10 years after replace the roof, this is what it's going to cost. We haven't reserved anything for that, and therefore we'll need to go to the membership. So we go to the membership in a condo situation here in Florida, for example, to do anything less than 100% fully fund the reserves. And if we don't do that, then we know we have to project that as a budgeting tool to say, okay, this is going to be our gap at these times, and really plan into the future and help prepare the board and the membership for that financial plan. So you're looking at the next year, you're looking at the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and so on and so forth. Very, very important there. As we go on to what's included in the reserve study, I'd like, Henry, if you could start us off here as far as when are these reserve studies required to be updated, and some of the key components that are included as well. And Michelle, we're going to bring you in here as well too.
The reserve amounts that are the predicate, Bill, for reserve studies center around funds equal to the total estimated deferred maintenance expense or total estimated replacement cost for an assessment or group of assessments over the remaining useful life of the assessment or group of assessments. And so it's so important to have a qualified participant and a professional weigh in on those particular aspects of it. And there's really no secret to how to determine those amounts and the guideposts for your reserve study through having a professional evaluation, which should be done every 3 years. The Department of Business and Professional Regulation publishes a budget and reserve schedule manual that's available to associations and their managers in order to help guide along the way in which to examine component parts of the common areas and common elements, as well as applying the arithmetic and the formula by which to come up with the dollars to equal what the law requires to be part of the reserve and what needs to be budgeted.
Exactly. And so when we look at this, remember it's included, right, Michelle? It's important to have an updated reserve schedule, whether or not you're funding reserves, right? So in either case, this is the planning tool, but take us through what does that look like and when we build this reserve schedule?
Well, it's really a very comprehensive analysis of all the components of your property. And the reserve studies, the very best ones, throw all of those components in there. It's very important, I think, and I always encourage boards to have the person preparing the study explain the study to you. Also, I think we're going to touch on that on the other slide, on the next slide as well, is to come in and present their findings and walk through the report with them. It really is set up for the framework of your entire property, and you can really understand how in depth they are going into each component of your building. Both the physical analysis and the financial analysis of that. How did they arrive at those numbers? They are the creators of the report, and so it's really important for the board to understand this is such a helpful and useful tool for them to strategize out projects coming in the future, whatever's on their wish list. You know, all of this comes into play here as well. So it's a very good analysis to give you a very clear overview of exactly what you're dealing with in dollars and cents down the road, and it goes out many years, so you can really take a look at what your physical inspection looks like, the financial analysis attached to it, and have them come and explain to your membership at a meeting and explain the report and how we came to it, so they can understand why it is that the reserves are necessary and full funding is a great thing.
Greg?
And Michelle, if I may add to that, when these reserve studies are done, they're done for 3-5-year terms. We do them on the commercial side of the business as well, whenever you, and quite honestly on the resi side of the business, whenever you trade a property, so that you understand what the components or what condition those components are in. I must stress at this point that that is just a billboard as to the issues on the property or what components need further study. The numbers provided for replacement useful life are very, very high level estimates that in most cases have not done destructive testing, have not gone in and physically looked at possibly some of the unforeseen conditions. And on all too many occasions, I've seen HOAs and condominium associations rest their expectations on that very first report without then taking that report and doing further investigation to truly understand the schedule of values. Sorry for the interruption there.
No, that was excellent.
Greg, thank you for that. I love the context because it's true. This is industry wide. So it could be an office building. You said residential, right? This could be an apartment building or apartment garden style community.
Could be your own personal single family home that you get a inspection on, and someone says termites, the other person says no termites.
No, it's an important perspective that displays anything real estate asset value. So great perspective there. And now, Michelle, if you could also talk us through, how do you select the right reserve study firm? If you need to update your reserve study, or maybe you don't have one and you want to get one. They're not tremendously expensive, but please walk us through that process and your experience.
Okay, glad to do that. It is very important that you choose the right company for your building. A good management company, of course, we have as our first bullet point, will be able to provide you with a list of experienced firms for you to interview and choose from, and perhaps some examples of some of the work that they've done. What's most important, I think, in this is that you choose a firm that has experience with communities similar to yours. We all know no two communities are alike, and it does show, I mean, even from the HOA to the condo world is completely different. So you just want to make sure that you have exactly the study that's going to be most beneficial for your building. It's important to also, as I touched on before, are they willing to present their findings to the board and to the membership? Because the board members should walk through the study with the reserve person and the engineer that's preparing the reserve study, and should understand it. And then the firm should be willing to come to the board meeting and explain it. It's a very complicated report. There's lots of questions around it. The biggest thing is when the board is trying to promote the funding of reserves, we want them to be able to attach it to real data. Why is this that we need this reserve fund? What is it all about? And a lot of times we find that some of the members, it's their first time living in a condo and they don't even understand where the reserve study comes in. But after meetings like that, where it's so informational, they really have a grasp on why it's so important for them as homeowners.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I think that, so, one of the key things you said there was an experienced firm. There's an interesting nuance here for communities that were converted from apartment communities to condominium communities, for example. They are included initially with what's called a converter reserve report, which is what the developer is required to file in the governing documents. And the converter reserve report is typically done by the architect of record. And so if you're in that type of scenario and you're going to go shopping and bid out the process for a new reserve report, which should be done, you might see differences, right, in opinions between an experienced reserve study firm with the right team and whatever that converter reserve or initial reserve report, wherever that came from, would be. So please don't be surprised if you do see some changes.
And I just want to add in real quick, if I may, to, we have the advantage because we do manage so many different types of communities that we are able to provide a lot of data and a lot of information and a lot of examples of some reports to our clients. So that's it's very useful to us out in the field that we're able to do that. It helps to get them to a place where they're comfortable with the firm that they choose.
Right. And Henry?
Bill, before moving on, I think it's important for the managers and association directors to understand that you don't have to repeat a full reserve study. You can have a full reserve study first with the site inspection to get measurements and counts of common elements, including assessing the condition of the common elements. But if you have good maintenance and good repair elements already in place, an updated reserve study can thereafter following a full reserve study, and that's less comprehensive than a full reserve study in that the reserve analysis verifies then measurements and conditions and will make limited evaluations on conditions and will update the photo inventory that's first created by the full reserve study. And then there's a later updated reserve study that can qualify without a site inspection, especially given the nature and the quality of the report that goes to your expert that comes from your management team. So there are ways in which to satisfy the reserve study requirements, which does not require an association to incur the cost which would be realized in an initial on-site, in-person evaluation that results in that study.
Henry, excellent points. I think you just answered 2 or 3 of the questions that I'm seeing coming through, and we're going to catch up with all of those. So thank you for that. And on the next slide, Henry, I'd love to keep you going on this topic with regard to updating that reserve study. You just touched on that. Can you walk us through what those requirements look like for the associations and what your thoughts are on that? And we'll chime in as a team.
I think the requirement really is outside of the time frame in which they have to be repeated. They're rather elemental. They have to be conducted by a licensed professional because the board members are relied upon or are entitled to rely upon professionals in making business decisions for the association. And we can later touch upon the value of the business judgment rule. I practice exclusively in Florida, but all states have a degree of protection for corporate directors, association directors, for the exercise of their business judgment, and a primary safety net for making that kind of business decision rests upon hiring the qualified professional in order to meet the standards and to address the criteria of which Michelle and I have been speaking.
Exactly. And I think another key component here is the difference between an annual update and a full report, as you just walked us through. The full report is the more expensive component here that you want to spend your time on. But I'll also add that I think a recommendation is when you make a decision and decide to engage on the full report, that you attach to that and speak with that company about how do we do the annual updates, which are very, very inexpensive and will fit into just any budget just about that I've seen. Right, Michelle? So that keeps the numbers coming and updated every year. Any thoughts, additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely an update, a review of it every year is super important, especially if you're doing a lot of projects within that year and a lot of improvements to areas. You want to make sure those are captured on there. It is a working document. It's meant to follow the property as it evolves. So you're really going to want to make sure that that is up to date so you can accurately, plan out the coming years accordingly. It's a great guide.
Perfect.
I would add
Excellent.
that also after a major assignment, Bill, if there's been a major assignment on the property that's run for about 12 to 24 months, you would definitely want to update that study for what has been done.
It's a beautiful thing, right? Once you complete the project, that then updates the reserve study and reduces your obligations for the following year. Excellent points, absolutely. So John, we're going to move into funding now. You are, as we set up the plan, right, and we set up the team, your team is critical to boards and finance committees as far as, okay, we know what we need to do now. We know when we have to do it. Now, how are we going to pay for that? So please, I'm going to hand this over to you to start talking about all things funding.
Yeah, it's the $1 million question, right? So after conceptually agreeing to undertake the project, the first question is how much, and the second question is how do we pay for it? So the results up on the slide are from a survey we conducted within the past 12 months, and it shows only 30% or so of our sample was prepared to fund their reservable projects with their own cash. So even that 30%, they might need some supplemental funding for upgrades or non-reservable items or additional cosmetics. And really, there's a couple of ways which they can raise that, and we'll get to them in the subsequent slide. The other 70% definitely need to secure some kind of funding, whether that be a loan or a special assessment or an increase in the operating budget. But paying with cash is really always the first option. I mean, I know it's hard to part with cash, right? We have money in the bank, but if you kind of think about the years of funding, right? That's what the money is there for, and that's why you're following the reserve study. So you can, when it's time, right? You can replace those items and pay for them in full. Just one other note on reserve funding: it's really an essential exercise for every board to take a look at the interest earned on their reserve accounts, right? And plan for the future, right? Are we under the FDIC limit? Do we need to open a new account? And these are some good questions to ask around the budget cycle. And your management partner should be really proactive in recommending that.
You know, it's interesting. So if you don't fund your reserves at all or 100%, it's interesting that survey was conducted coast to coast here in the US. And so you're not alone, right? And we have actual data on that. And as we walk into lending, John, you're dealing with the banks all the time and you're looking at association balance sheets. But I think one thing I found to be interesting is even when associations do fund reserves, you may note that in this lending environment, the cost of capital, it's almost irresistible for boards.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, you're taking the words right out of my mouth. I mean, the interest rate environment is so favorable. I've worked with communities that fit within that 30% sample size we have on the previous slide. And even though they have money, they say, let's do a loan, right? So association lending for capital improvements is really nothing new. And the general parameters for securing a loan are pretty straightforward too. So the lenders will require delinquency not to exceed a certain threshold, which is usually about 10%. They'll require a repayment mechanism to be activated, usually a special assessment. If there's a vote required by the membership in the docs, they're going to make sure that, you know, all the I's are dotted on that. And the beauty is really you can line up a longer repayment horizon with a short-term project, right? So you're paying for a project over 5 or 10 years when the work might only take about 6 months to do, or 12 months, right? A much shorter horizon. And it really gives the flexibility to the members who may not have the cash to lay out right away. You don't have to match up your special assessment with your payment schedule to the contractors who are undertaking the work, right? And we'll get to that in a moment. So, it just becomes too attractive sometimes, and we are seeing a lot of participation in capital improvement lending now because of the interest rate environment.
So Henry, along that same lines, we're thinking about what's a good business decision. We think in terms of financial engineering. There's so many smart board members out there that think in these terms. Keep us in the guidepost. If you are considering a loan, Henry, what would you advise your clients to look for, perhaps in their governing documents, vote requirements, et cetera?
There are a couple of very important issues to keep in mind here, Bill. One is authority in order to borrow money, purpose for which money may be borrowed, potential limitation on amount of money that can be borrowed, purpose for doing so, and the board members have to be very cognizant of what their prospective lender covenants are going to be in terms of what's going to be asked of the association by way of collateral, and if the association has the authority to give the collateral required by its prospective lender in order to be able to secure the obligation. So there are preliminary threshold issues that have to be addressed and satisfied, and it's going to have to be satisfied to the lender's satisfaction as well, because the lender wants to make sure that it has a enforceable security interest in the unlikely event that the association is unable to repay. But there is a walkthrough that has to be conducted in order to see if the association board has the authority in the first instance, and if the association can do so but requires a owner vote.
And that's always the first step, Henry, right? So when we're talking with our boards about the possibility of funding a project through a loan, checking with your attorney and defining what those rights are of the board, of the association, and what they can get a loan for is so important, because we don't want to lead an association down a road only to find out that the docs don't allow for something. So that is always the first step. Read your docs, check with your attorney, and talk about it, right? We are planning on taking a loan out for X in the amount of X, right? Does everything does it look like we can do it? Is there a membership vote required? And then, when you think about that, a membership vote, are we going to be able to get the votes to do it too? So all of those discussions really have to happen before we engage a bank and say, okay, we're ready to go. Let's underwrite and see if we can get a loan.
Yeah, and that's the package, right, John? When your team is with First Service Financial is consulting with the board, and you're going to the market, to all the banks out there that are willing to do this, that's part of their due diligence, right? You're getting all that information together and working with Henry's team and everyone to put that together up front for the bank. They're going to request
absolutely,
no matter what. Okay, got it. Okay, good. So John, I'd like you to continue and then bring Michelle in here. What are you seeing as far as when you're working on a funding plan? Walk us through some of your perspectives, what you're hearing from boards with regard to the three options, right?
Yeah, so there's funding through a loan, right? There's funding through your own reserves, and then there's special assessment or increasing your dues. And special assessment, you may be passing a special assessment if you get a loan, right? You've got that repayment mechanism, but it's just stretched out over a longer period of time. Really, for me, the good rule of thumb in just special assessing your membership for a project is kind of working backward, taking the amount and creating a schedule of what each unit would have to contribute, and then making a decision of at the board level, is that sustainable, right? If we pass a special assessment, will our unit owners be able to pay X number of dollars over this period of time? And that really triggers a loan conversation, right? If the answer is yes, we think everybody can handle it, then great. If the answer is no, then we talk about a lending option, right? Because really, when you're special assessing or increasing your dues specifically to fund a project, you really have to line up with the timeline that the work is performed in. And some of these projects might have big expenses associated with them, but be completed in a fairly short period of time, right? 12 months or 6 months or 18 months. And if you can't line those up exactly, you're going to have to find another way to get the funds to do that, right?
Exactly. Michelle, I'd love your input as well, what you're seeing and working with boards on in this area.
Yeah, great information, John. And exactly, one of the things you want to do first is, take into consideration the delinquency rates. Not only does the bank review that, but that's something that the board really has to take into consideration is the membership's ability to pay and what that looks like. I just want to throw in for a minute in the COVID-19 pandemic impact on your association. What does that look like for your homeowners, and what has that done if you are going through engaging your delinquency rates pre-COVID versus now, and project necessity and that sort of thing. So it's hugely important to just really review the membership's ability to pay and provide a project funding structure, right? We talked, John, you said, the project may take 6 months, but we can spread it out over, the bank is offering us terms to spread it out over a 5 to 10 year period. And those that want to pay up front, right, are going to get their payments in before a certain date. When we're structuring that, that's hugely important. A lot of people just want to pay up front, and they can, and that's better for the association as far as the project goes anyway, to get that cash up front and then having that date where they're included in the funding. So, project funding structure that works for your community, the loan that works for your community specifically.
Yeah, that's a good point, Michelle. So even if the association is taking out a loan, we still offer the ability for a unit owner to pay up front, right? If they have the cash, they don't have to accrue the interest expense. So here's your portion. If you want to pay it now, we're happy to take it, right?
Mm-hmm, exactly.
Yeah, and Michelle, you brought up so much there. In this year with COVID, 2020 has presented no shortage of challenges. And when we look at the different funding, we're looking at some associations that are that have seen increased just regular operating expenses, right? With additional staffing required for amenities and cleaning, for example, increased cleaning supplies in some cases. We have, and we're going to do another session on specifically budgeting for this. But then there's also, we're looking down the road into the fourth quarter when, certain federal programs start to wind down. How many investors are in each community, and do they have renters? And are the knowing your community is so critically important, right? Are the renters paying the rent? Are they able to pay the rent? Is that going to impact the investor's ability to pay not just a special assessment, but their maintenance fees? So we want to project and look at that into the fourth quarter of 2020 and how we go into 2021. And I think that point that you made is to be prudent and sensitive and realistic about, because every community is different in this way. It's about knowing your population and knowing the unit owner. So very, very important as we think about this in the overall funding process. So excellent. So Greg, pulling you back in here now, we've set the foundation for funding, and we've looked at different options. We are now moving forward with how are we going to pay for projects, when to implement them, and we've looked at the reserve schedule and why that matters as well. So if you could kind of kick us off here on your perspective on how to prioritize these projects and begin to execute from a construction management perspective.
Yeah, not a problem. Well, as I mentioned before, that reserve study is going to be highly important along with the preventive maintenance plan that's put in place on a yearly aspect. Now, everything that we've discussed up until this point has really revolved around the management of the asset, planning of the asset, the financial aspects of how to pay for things that need to be done. really your project manager is going to be an integral part of this process, from the identification of any of the items on a priority standpoint, i.e. our roof has five years left of useful life, or with 3 years away from 40 years certification. Oh my goodness, we're having an issue with our AC system. Now, if you're only addressing one of those items at a time and not viewing it from a holistic perspective, you may end up doing your roof before you realize that you have major maintenance on your HVAC system. And your HVAC, if it's done after your roof, could cause the voidance of your warranty if it's not done adequately. Case in point, we have an assignment that is contracted for a re-roof, and there are some HVAC issues that are taking place on the property, and really that is a prioritization and logistical planning event that really needs to take place. Initially, we had the main rooftop being done with ancillary items after the fact, and we've really had to look at the planning and scheduling of this assignment so that we can hopefully get the AC work taken care of right as the roofer is getting to that main section or geography of the roof and scope of their project. So all of this really focuses on the fact that you need an expert assisting your property manager in prioritizing the high level, prioritizing and coordinating the high level functions that need to take place, and then communicating with your financial arm as to how to get it done. So from that perspective, really early involvement is the only way to stay on top of it.
I think that's when, you know, it's valuable to have you in the process, right, Michelle? Because some of the things we're seeing in this environment too is, well, first, you don't want to do a project that needs to be done and then mess up another project that was just done, right? You just defeated the purpose and damaged the value, perhaps the warranty or the maintenance on that component. And then second, and I'll stick with the HVAC example, Greg and Michelle, is that, you know, in this environment, we do have associations now when they're looking at air handlers, chillers and cooling towers and that entire system, and they may have to do a replacement or even an upgrade to the system. You know, they're looking at things like ultraviolet light and how to help clean and scrub the air more. If they're looking at we're working on another project right now where they're upgrading their amenity areas and they're looking at more touchless doors, right? Automatic opening doors and that type of infrastructure. So that's very, very proactive in the age of COVID and any other transmission, right, into the future.
Well, think of the implication of the new ELSS requirements, right? Life safety, and how that, unlike anything previously, is really going to affect the interior common area spaces of a lot of where we all live, right? That is going to be a project that's going to affect our living environment more than any other assignment that we've ever, or any of us have ever really experienced, right? Live work going on inside our residences that is going to be common area and very, you know, very implicating in our daily lives. All needs to be considered.
It's exactly right. We bring this to the board, right, Michelle? And they look at ultimately making the final, you know, the business decision based on this advice. Anything else you'd like to add on this prioritization piece?
Is just project planning is everything for anything you're going to look into, and relying on your experts to weigh in on that is hugely important. Like the project manager in a situation of, you know, here's what our goal is and how do we get there, because everybody's going to bring a different perspective to the table, right? The manager is going to bring the resident communication and impact to the conversation. The project manager is going to bring the structure, the pre-con meetings, you know, pre-construction meetings. Planning is so important. The planning meetings all throughout the project. You know, it's just bringing all of the parties together, right, to make sure that, and the order of importance, right? You don't do the roof before you replace the HVAC and that sort of thing. So I just think you can't do enough around planning and taking enough time to really make sure that you have the best plan in place before you endeavor into it.
Yeah, and Bill, on the financial side, if you're going to seek a loan for these improvements, the bank's going to look at what you're not doing, right? What are the projects on the horizon, and how are you going to pay for them? Because you're paying us back for these projects, right? So this part of the planning process is really key, especially when you're seeking financing, to say, okay, this is what's not included, and here's the plan for that, right?
Exactly.
Just absolutely perfect. Exactly. And I think also with this team, if board members and managers today can visualize this at their community, this is really on this call. You want to do this same call. You want to have this same team, because a lot of this work, and Michelle, thank you so much. The planning is so critical. This work all goes on before it's presented. Everything is presented for decision and at an open board meeting with an agenda and to the membership. And we all know that the membership is going to come down and they will have these questions. And so doing this planning in advance with your team and setting everything up is really going to help you to be successful toward the end. So excellent points on the planning process side. Greg, we're gonna pull you back in here too. Get us into the weeds on defining the scope, right? What should we really be looking for on the scope of any single project to be successful?
All right. As I said, scoping a project is probably the most important aspect of really what needs to take place. It defines your ultimate budget, and really that initial reserve study really just identifies the items that need to be focused on from a holistic perspective, i.e. HVAC has useful life or roof has useful life. Each project is very, very different, and requires a professional to come on board and to understand what is taking place in that area of your property or with that specific structural component. Now, defining the project scope really depends on what is going on. And in most cases, you are going to need a professional consultant dependent on the system that is involved, structural being PE, HVAC being an MEP engineer, and so on and so forth. And as you start understanding what is taking place in that area, so you are starting to build a scope. Because ideally, in defining what your scope is, you're going to need to contact those professionals and ask them for a proposal or a study to define what is going on, and then subsequently a repair method in order to remediate the issue. Now, a project manager really is the person that is meant to be there from the initial point to define those high-level hard and soft aspects of what needs to take place. Now, in a single item like an HVAC system, you don't necessarily have major differences in scope. You're not necessarily going across mechanical, electrical, plumbing, fire and life safety, and everything else if you're just replacing an air handler unit, for instance. But if you've got an ELSS, or if you've got a major roof replacement that are affecting other components, those need to be estimated from a hard and soft perspective. And what I mean by hard and soft is the soft perspective of a project is the design implications, the municipal costs, and everything that is intangible. The hard cost is then what it takes for a physical contractor to execute. Now, in your scoping of the project and evaluation of that project, each of your vendors or go-to experts in those areas is going to have a very different or maybe not so different opinion of what needs to take place. All of that information is going to help you then build your scope document that you can then request from your 2 or 3 favorite providers to satisfy the bidding requirements of the board or the HOA, and put out an equal apples to apples, or as close as you can get, request for qualifications and request for proposal. That way, your professional can then ensure what you're getting is hopefully what you're asking for, and write a recommendation to your property management team, the board, and the stakeholders as to the best path forward for that specific issue. At that same time, they're hopefully getting input from subcontractors as to the initial implications of cost so that the board is aware as to what the whole picture looks like from the get-go, and then hopefully is refined through the process until actual contract. So, you know, from that perspective, the scoping of an assignment will involve multiple site visits from multiple parties, including your stakeholders, property management, and board members, to truly understand what's going on before you really start reporting and put the cart in front of the apple horse, so to say. Really, factors that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, as we've recently experienced, are the hurricane implications, right? Obviously, those are affecting execution of projects from delay perspective, and also from a cost perspective. We have an assignment up in Boca Raton that literally we were negotiating yesterday that has a hurricane delay charge of $80,000 per occurrence. So major implications to projects with regard to hurricanes. And really, this goes back to defining scope, right? If most of these assignments have a large component of unforeseen, and as all of you know, in any business negotiation, it's far better to be proactive than reactive. Case in point, a hurricane. Negotiate that before the hurricane gets here, rather than being reactive to the scenario and having no point of leverage. You know, COVID is a new issue for everyone, really. Understanding how what the implications are to your daily life as residences, and how that is shutting down common area functions or affecting common area functions. We're having the same challenges on our projects. It's not necessarily delaying it from a production standpoint unless we have a whole crew go down, in which case we're writing that into our contracts that 5-person delay or man-hour delay to production needs to be notified, or HOA and board need to be notified. But more, we're seeing those issues come up with responsiveness and permitting and municipal-based requirements. So all these things need to be considered when you're scoping a project. And when you say scope, it doesn't only mean what you're physically doing. It includes the contract documents, the budget associated with those contract documents, and the schedule as well. All of them are a living document and a living function that is going to be with you from the moment you have the idea to start putting this project together all the way through completion.
Yeah. And just, I want to bring Henry in here in a moment based on a couple of things you said, but you know, Greg, you do this every day. You're evaluating the scope of work. You're evaluating the bids that come through. You support your clients and reviewing all of that. But just, you know, a very basic thing is when a contractor is bidding on the contract and maybe they try to cut a corner on a piece of the scope here or leave something out there, right? Like, to me, that just disqualifies them. They did not follow the instructions, assuming we put them forth. But just give us a brief overview of how hard you're looking at that to make sure they're 100% covered, our clients.
Well, I mean, that's the whole point of going onto a project with multiple subcontractors. You can't just trust one opinion, right? Much like engineering problems. As every engineer will tell you, it's a mathematical equation. Their math may be slightly different to someone else's math or have a slight difference of opinion, which is going to yield you a different result, right? Perfect case in point, looking at ADA access on Miami Beach, all right? There is a property that we're looking at that is trying to come up with a new ADA compliant access. We went to one physical provider and they designed a full concrete ramp, right? At pretty exorbitant, well, not exorbitant in cost, but concrete is going to be expensive and it's expanding the footprint of the building. The one thing we try and do is always come to the table with alternatives. We saw that initial option, right? And immediately we thought, all right, this can't be the only solution. Let's think of something else. And we came up with a wooden ramped deck approach, which is almost 1/10 of the cost of what a formal concrete application would have been, and is going to be far easier to get through the permitting aspects as well. So, you know, to physically address your concerns with regard to a contractor missing items and or an engineer or a vendor physically missing items, the contractor missing items, he is going to be looking at those drawings as hard as possible, right? And it really depends on our contracting method as to how we're going to really help that contractor be successful, because it's not just a scenario, we're not in a scenario where it's a hard bid and you're asking for a lump sum price on a cookie, right? This is something that, and in most cases, these pieces of real estate have a lot of unforeseen conditions. So it is up to the professionals on site really to provide a detail as to what they want accomplished. When items get missed, depending on whether they're unforeseen conditions or clearly a missed condition, is what typically will drive that to be a change order discussion and or a contingency discussion.
Yeah, and that's what we want to avoid as much as possible, right? Any change orders or really mitigate them. And Henry, another item Greg alluded to here, as you're digging through these construction documents and you're looking at the scope, you're also considering some of these delays, right, in service and what that should look like, and providing advice to your clients. Tell us some of the things that you look for and some of the things you should expect to receive from contractors, whether it's weather or any other problems with the actual execution of the project, how to protect the association.
Bill, the input starts before you even get to the bid process. You just want to make sure that the qualifications for the bid process are comprehensive, and certainly that's been alluded to already. But also you want to be able to assist the association manager in taking advantage of public information about those who are attempting to qualify for the bids. And that is to say that there is enough information with regard to professional records to see if there are any claims against the licenses of the applying parties, to see if there's any record of lawsuits involving those who wish to bid. Also taking a look at those projects which are identified by those who participate in the bid process to see how fast and how frequently they responded to instances in which the city or county had pointed out failures of tests during the course of other projects. And so there are public records that are able to present a narrative about those who are participating in the bid process to see who has the best history in terms of being responsive. When it comes to the contract, of course, if it involves the possibility of financing, you just need to be sensitive to the loan covenants to make sure that the construction contracts are compliant with what you anticipate your funding requirements are going to be. And then lastly, there are certain provisions that your management teams and our clients historically look to include, including liquidated damages, in order to be able to quantify upfront the impact of there being delays in delivery of a product or the completion of a project. You also look for provisions for performance bonds in order to make sure that there is money with which to finish a project in the unfortunate event of a default, or a payment bond to make sure that subcontractors are satisfied with legitimate obligations in the event that there is a failure of the contractor to pay those obligations, and to attempt to avoid liens coming against the common elements or common areas of communities. And so those are the issues with which we deal, and those are the issues to which boards need to be sensitive and alerted as they travel down these paths.
Yeah, that's great advice, Henry. I think that work you do in helping to prepare for the bid process all the way through the scope and ultimate approval of a contract is very important. You're able to go to the courthouse and look at the records and see what's going on and help advise your clients. It's great to do that due diligence, right? We can all check references, but I love what you just described, which is a deeper dive into those bigger projects. Michelle, I'd like you to, anything you want to add on this part of the conversation, and we're also going to talk about next, the hiring of a project manager depending on the project.
Just that, taking a virtual tour now in our times that we're going through right now, but a visitor virtual tour of other properties that have done similar projects, I think is hugely beneficial. I myself have taken a few tours of something a board was considering doing, and we were in the very preliminary planning stages, and we arranged through some other RDs in my division to take a visit to those different properties, and we ended up changing the entire scope of the project. This is pre-COVID, of course, but it just opened up new opportunities for ways of thinking of doing things, like Greg touched on earlier. We had that expertise to bring in there of, look, this is a project that was completed. This was their original scope, was something similar to what you were thinking, and here's what the outcome was and what worked much better for the community as well. So I just think it's a good time in the planning and defining the project scope to make sure that you do that. You really go and see some other properties similar to yours and everything. Consider the factors that affect timing right now with the COVID-19 and any projects you're going to take on. There's so many precautions that we need to take with regards to residents and restrictions to common areas during the whole project timeline. So you really want to have everybody involved in that process to think of everything, staging areas, where the crew is going to be eating lunch, those sorts of things. Everything comes into play in here. So there's so much to consider. It's just really everybody coming together in that process.
Right, and that's for us, right, with management and staging and managing. We did see crews in some projects on the onset of the pandemic be reduced due to CDC requirements and our COVID-19 protocols that we put together. And, just this morning, I saw the tropical disturbance number 11, which they're forecasting to be Josephine within 24 hours of this call. Right now, the forecast doesn't tend to lend itself to a direct threat to us, and this should not be an issue at all. But we also know that the forecasting can be iffy, so we're going to keep an eye on that certainly over the weekend and as we go into next week. And that, you're right. I mean, that impacts the destaging of a contractor, right, and then restaging after the storm.
Demobilization and mobilization is a huge cost. So that's something to consider in your contract phase as well. Like Henry was touching on, just going through it with a fine-tooth comb. And also, and some of our contracts that we've done on property, we've even defined how many workers the GC is going to commit to working on our project at any given time. That's another great thing in the planning stages, to say that they're going to guarantee us 8 workers on this particular project at any time and have that written in there as well.
Yeah, good point. And although we were lucky too with Isaias, some projects did demobilize. Think some of our friends up the coast were not as lucky, but we were lucky here. But you're right, that's an additional project cost, right? That comes into play. So Michelle, take us into this and kick us off on whether an association should consider a project manager and when, and what are your thoughts on this? You've seen it both ways.
I think the project manager is hugely important. They're going to be focused on ensuring that the contractor is doing everything that is needed in accordance with those construction guidelines, right? They're going to be the experts that are going to be knowing on the swing stage, watching the way the crack is being repaired, stuff like that. The manager's perspective is going to be, of course, communicating to the residents in the community the project progress and reporting to the board as well. So I think the project manager in this situation is just ensures the adherence to all the standards and codes. Managers aren't equipped to do that, and you definitely do want somebody that's looking out to make sure that everything that you're paying for is exactly what you're getting, and certifying that work that's being completed.
Sure. And Henry, would you like to chime in on the effectiveness of project manager on this?
I would. Thank you, Bill. The association attorney is primarily committed to making sure that there's compliance with the underlying documents and statutory and administrative rule of law. However, a great deal of our time is spent in liability avoidance. Board members, Bill, have a great deal of discretion in the management of association affairs. I alluded earlier to the business judgment rule, which is a policy of judicial restraint born out of the recognition that directors have a better handle on the management of association matters rather than judges. And one of the principal components of the business judgment rule and what establishes that level of protection for directors is the right to rely upon qualified professionals like a project manager. And so there is not only the practical contribution of the project manager, there's a very real legal protection that arises from finding, employing, and engaging and listening to a qualified project manager.
Yeah, and that's, risk avoidance, risk mitigation, right? For the board, I think there's a great peace of mind that we have somebody helping to oversee the actual execution, Greg, of the project, right? The contractors, the staging, the following up to making sure, right, that they're doing the work to code and avoiding any, failures from when the inspections come. And then Michelle, on the other side, the manager is really focused on the property manager, I should say. And your team is really focused on communicating to the residents through the project, what to expect when, assisting with the staging, but really handling the day-to-day operations of the association during a project, right? So I feel like depending on the size and scope, which is what we've been talking about, a project manager is a prudent investment for all of those items.
Absolutely. And, the manager is going to be meeting with the project manager all along the way. And the project manager is going to be presenting the information. For example, stacks 2, 3, and 4 are going to be covered, right? Their balconies are going to be inaccessible for this length of time, according to the timeline of the project. I'm just going to be in a recent example. The manager's focus is going to be when they get that information, right, to how can I best communicate this to my residents, and let's make a schedule going all the way around the building so that we can give them both a heads up that this may be happening to their particular area on this time frame, and when it's happening, what the duration of that is going to be, and then what the follow-up is going to be for the inspections of their balcony and making it more accessible to them after the fact, reopening those balconies. So it's hugely important because, again, the project manager is going to be focused on the project as a whole. The property manager is going to be getting that information from the project manager directly and communicating that to the residents and the board, right? And giving them a heads up. And we all know in our business, communication is key. That's number one. I don't care what you're doing on the property, is it communicating, because it impacts our residents' lifestyle.
Now,
and we want that to be as, as seamless as possible. So
I can't support that enough, Michelle. I want to ask Greg a couple of questions as well. But you're right. For the residents and their guests in the building, they want to know what's going on when, and they're going to have questions. This is, to whatever extent, a disruption of the lifestyle, the sound, the dust, everything that's going on. And a lot of that pressure falls on us as a management team. We try our best to shield the board as much as possible, but some pressure could get to the board too. And that communication piece should not be underestimated. And Greg, 2 things. I just saw a question come through, and we get this question all the time. And then a second thing. So the first thing is, should your engineer of record or your PE be your project manager. And number two, specifically with regard to project management, I'm just going to say it. Something's going to go wrong during this project.
Always
Something
does.
is absolutely going to go wrong. And how are we going to deal with that? So if you could address those two items, please.
Yeah, so, you know, proactive planning is always the best way to remediate against issues that come up in a project. And project management, as you folks have stated, is the management of risk aversion. All right, it's planning and risk aversion. Now, I want to bring two cases in point that both Henry and Michelle alluded to and spoke about previously. Your property manager has a full-time job and is typically managing a multi-million-dollar operation and or business.
That's
a project that is typically executing on any asset is typically, if not half-time or a full-time based assignment, and will typically burn what your residency HOA budget would be in a year in a lot less than that. So imagine having to maintain your full-time job and then get another half-time or full-time job thrown on your back, which is burning the same financial value. It's a lot to deal with, never mind the communication flow. So if you want your property manager to be focused on your living environment as the prime focus of their day-to-day life, they really need to be allowed to focus on the management of the asset and allow someone else to focus on the management of the capital spend, right? And that's my first very generic statement. The second statement goes to Henry's conversation regarding legality. At Colliers, we obviously service all asset types, from retail, industrial, multifamily apartments, hospitality, all the way through office, and obviously residential, HOA, and condo. On our commercial side of the business, we do not like or typically allow our property managers to run major assignments because, God forbid, if something goes wrong, the first thing asked in arbitration is, do you have a project management team? Why was he not running that assignment? If there was no project manager available, all right, you get past that question. But that is typically legally the first thing that is delved into is, why was someone not qualified representing you in this assignment? Now I'm going to jump into a little bit about why hire a project manager. Well, you've got a property manager on site, which is an important stakeholder. You've got a legal partner, which is an even more important stakeholder, but they are involved at certain aspects and certain times. Your project manager is the one that is responsible from a legal perspective for the maintenance of that contract over the term of its life, i.e., he is the one that is going to have a day-to-day understanding of what the unit prices are, what the obligations of the soft consultants are, what the obligations of the contractors are. And everyone always says, we never want to pull this contract out of the drawer, but someone better know what's written in that contract and what it obligates you as a homeowners association to protect your best interests and avert the risk. That's being proactive. So, as all of you know that are probably on this call, having been in business in some way, shape, or form, there are very basic rules that need to be followed in plain business that are also applied to project management. And those very basics are agendas, meeting minutes, action items, schedules, budgets that are all effective and updated on a weekly basis pursuant to the action items needed and or expunged from that weekly meeting. And everyone on this call, I would be more than happy to send you a very, very basic boilerplate scope of service that you can hand to any project manager, whether it be in IT or in construction, and it should be the basis of your request on any project going forward. And you will mostly see weekly meetings, weekly action items, updates to budget, updates to schedule, and all of those things that will help Henry, God forbid, if this does go to litigation, litigate on your behalf with all the information that he needs. Not to mention the fact that if the board has any questions with regard to what's been happening across the project lifeline, the project manager can step up there with a stack full of meeting minutes and rebut anything, or not even rebut, confirm anything that was discussed in the prior meetings, therefore holding everyone accountable. Now, please take this with a grain of salt, but in most cases, ownership is the one where the accountability lies the most, i.e. if owners don't make decisions, if owners hold up work, if owners change things, there are going to be implications to that contract that need to be talked about and stayed on top of, right? So the project manager is your best friend in not only being your frontline of communication with your consultants and your contractors and holding them accountable, but also holding the board accountable for the decisions that are made throughout the project. So I cannot stipulate enough how important it is to have an intermediary, so-called Switzerland there, to lay everything on the table for the stakeholders to make the best decisions at that point in time and moving forward.
Yeah.
Thanks. I hope that answered your question in a long way round, Bill.
No, Greg, it did. I don't think I could ever sell you as being from Switzerland, though, with your accent. So I understand the implication there. So good stuff. So Michelle, this is next topic is about bids, right? That whole bid process, and we're going to bring the whole team in on this. Henry's involved, for example, everybody. Big piece of the pie here, right? So let's spend a few minutes on bids. Give us, Michelle, kick us off with some of your recommendations on the process and the purchasing programs that we do.
Well, one of the greatest things that we do have being for service and managing the most associations is the resources, right, that we bring in the real-time experience. So we have what's called in my division a shout out, where, you know, whenever a board is thinking of embarking on a certain project, you know, I send out a shout out to the entire team, which goes all the way down to even our Miami team. And we get real-time, you know, references on different contracting, different GCs and engineers or whoever that may be. And what it allows us to do is, you know, somebody who was great 2 years ago is expanded their business so far that they're spread way too thin and they're not getting things completed on time or being as timely with communications to us, or, you know, delivering what they have promised. So it really helps us to get who's the best fit for that property at that particular time. And that's a best practice that we utilize. I know that all the property managers do that on a regular basis. And we are able to, of course, feel more confidence in presenting that information to our boards as well and membership accordingly. So that's a best practice around that. Insist on proper certifications in insurance. I do know that through some of our partner insurance companies, and John Lee knows about this, but we have some of our insurance companies actually will evaluate the entire construction, whatever GC you choose, and anybody attached to that, all of their licenses and insurances and the policies, and make sure that they are fulfilled through the duration of the project. So they have specific groups in the insurance companies that are actually committed to doing that for us. So that's a huge thing, because some of the insurance policies that they have in place around workers' comp and stuff like that has lapsed during a project, and you want to make sure that you have somebody monitoring that. It's huge importance. You know, insurance is one of those things we don't need it till we need it. So we want to make sure that the association is protected. That's first and foremost, most important. Address associations' potential liabilities. Again, attorney and insurance come in here. Hugely important having them involved in that process. And request the list of safety protocols the company has taken to address the COVID-19 pandemic. That's hugely important right now. We have certain entrances and exits to our property, and how that's working, how that's going to work with the team during that construction. If we have to block an exit, how we're going to, you know, assign another exit, and what that looks for us as far as even an emergency situation with traffic flow and, you know, emergency ingress egress. So it's soliciting the bids. You want to take all of that into consideration. You want to make sure the team is involved in all of that.
Right. And John, I need to get you in here on that. Michelle mentioned the insurance and what the broker should be doing.
Yeah.
That's part of you.
Yeah, absolutely. And the key word that Michelle mentioned was policies, right? I mean, a lot of times when we undertake these big projects, we'll ask for a certificate of insurance from the contractor, and that's good, but we really want the policies. We want to review the exclusions and make sure that the policies don't preclude them for insuring us, right? There might be some exclusions in there that might knock them out, and we want to have those discussions up front because, Michelle, just as you said, you don't need it until you need it, and we don't want to find out that a contractor is not insured to do work on a building over 4 stories, and we're a 30-story building, but they're showing you a certificate that says they can do work, right? So it's really important to get in there, look at the exclusions, look at the policies, and say, this works, this jives, we can, what's on the certificate, this stands behind it, and it's good.
Yeah, John, and I would agree with you there. And part of your project manager's scope of work, to be perfectly honest with you, is to validate the vendors that are coming on site. And for anyone that you're going to contract with, ask for the W-2s, ask for the copies of insurance. From an executionary standpoint on the Collier's side of the business, we actually put each one of our contractors and vendors through a national credit check that basically looks at liens, at safety, at credit, makes sure that they are not outstanding on any projects, so that the risk of them failing on your assignment is minimized. And really that is meant to be maintained throughout the assignment, much as everyone here is saying.
Yeah, that's so important, Greg. So we might undertake a project that's 12 months long, and we'll review insurance coverage that maybe comes up for renewal. That comes up for renewal in January, right? So when they're renewing, we want to calendar that and review all over again, right? Even though we're mid-project at that point.
For sure.
That excellent point. And you know what else occurs to me, John and Greg, and Henry, chime in here too. When you solicit bids, you're not just sending out a scope of work. There are additional requirements, right? That bidder should have all of these items that you're talking about as part of their bid package right up front. Yep. That helps us to evaluate their qualifications to begin with.
That is correct.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, Bill, it goes beyond that too, because the bid specifications really do become scope of work as exhibits to the contract. And the thing that you attempt to avoid, if possible, is unnecessary change orders by having very specific bid specifications. And then you have the ability to hold the contractor to his estimate of being able to perform the actual work requirements in your bid specifications. Project manager, critical with regard to helping you craft sufficient specific bid specifications that become part of the contract. Of course, both the Condominium Act and the Homeowners Association Act in Florida set standards by which certain items that have that reach certain thresholds of percentages of budgets requiring the bid process. The Condominium Act, if it exceeds 5% of the total annual budget, including reserves. The Homeowners Association Act, if the work exceeds 10% of the annual budget with reserves, if any, those are required to have bids, competitive bids, in order for the board to select or have the information that comes from a bid to empower the board to make the right decision.
And Bill, if I might add here, this actually goes back to the scoping and planning discussion. Your project manager is obviously going to speak to multiple consultants and multiple contractors in order to gain a bid. He actually needs to put a bid sheet together instead of just asking the contractors to supply a cost and their expectation of your opinion or their opinion as to what you said. In other words, that project manager is even more important in the bid solicitation process, because he's got to ultimately compile those numbers pursuant to the scope that he wrote, pursuant to what Henry said about the design documents, and ultimately then be able to advise the board and the management company as to the best respondent for that work and why.
Mm-hmm. And if I may add for a minute too, how important that is with the project manager, because, you know, they're going to do an on-site inspection, hopefully. I mean, I really think this is an important part of planning any project with the prospect bidders, walking them through that actual scope of work and having a physical look at exactly what they're going to be bidding on, because it always comes down to when it's on the paper, oh, we didn't know, we didn't realize this was a mural and this was this. And so it's really important because the project manager walks them through each one of those line items on that scope. So.
Well,
Right.
and again, to the point of proactivity, right? Most of these projects are going to come with unforeseen conditions.
Always.
So as we have all experienced in the past with unforeseen conditions, those budgets tend to grow. So if you know you are going to undertake a concrete restoration project where there are going to be multiple unforeseen conditions, be proactive in negotiating what may not be part of the scope, but what may very well become part of the scope. Right?
Hugely important. Yeah, and your change orders, your change orders and contingency, right, shouldn't be something that was not well thought out or well planned. Those are not change orders. The change orders is an unforeseen condition, right? So big distinction there, but that helps in that process. It's hugely
I mean, believe it or not,
no
there's concrete holding up your roof. And you may have a re-roofing project, but if you're not thinking of the substructure that's holding it, you might have missed something.
You're exactly right. Or, you know, a condition that just came up, we were doing some roof work to some other areas with tile that I mentioned, and it was a great time because the warranty on the actual flat part of the roof was going to be expiring. So even though we had 2 years, it was a great time. We had all the equipment up there, and we looped it into one, and we experienced a savings on some of that because of that.
You probably ended up saving money from doing that and a lot of heartache and pain.
Yes, and just to add to this, because, you know, this is our world sometimes, but, you know, the elevated pool decks, right, which we love downtown, you know, a huge part of the expense, right, is getting the materials, right, to where it needs to go. So it's not necessarily the work, but sometimes just strategically getting all that concrete up to where it needs to go.
More expensive than the work that needs to be done at times.
Yeah.
Exactly. So doing 2 projects that you may have coming up, let's just say, you know, you're doing it, you know, waterproofing an area or something like that, but you have some planters that you're going to throw in there on that pool deck, and you may have your jacuzzi is coming up in a little while because some of those tiles are lifting. So you want to look at all of that together. The project manager's hugely helpful in those areas of pointing those out, because sometimes we're not thinking that far ahead, and that's what they do all day long. So
yeah, I mean, if you're going to take your car into the shop, you're going to ask them to check everything, not just the brakes, right?
Exactly. Great. It's a great analogy. Yeah.
Well, it's a good point too. I think the objective in planning for success certainly is that this team more than pays for itself as you go through major projects. John, I'm going to pull you in on the next slide here as we get close. I want to try to get to a couple of questions, but now we've wrapped it up, and now we have to do some updates. The work isn't over yet. Just touch on this if you wouldn't mind for a moment, and how this impacts the financials of the association moving forward.
Yeah, sure. So I think it was touched upon earlier. You know, when you complete a big project, you want to update your reserve study, and you don't want to do it with just one of those annual updates. You actually want the inspection, right? We have new components. We want someone to come and lay eyes on them and say, this is useful life. This is what they look like. They're going to take some more pictures. So it updates the whole plan for how you're going to fund your reserve. So anytime you complete one of these big projects, you really want to invite your reserve survey study to come back and do a physical inspection.
Right, exactly. And that folds right into the next year's budget plan, right?
Yep,
and
exactly.
Your business plan that we talked about as well. So really putting all these components together will make your lives a whole lot easier moving forward. So as we go to some key takeaways, some key conclusions from today's, I've made some notes, and watching many of the comments come through. Good stuff. Obviously, it all begins with your planning and your preventative maintenance programming at each association for each asset. We need to be on top of this. We need to have a report. Your management team should be doing a lot of that heavy lifting up front. Your reserve study, of course, work with your management team and your association attorney to do that. Then look at fully funding reserves or not. How do you want to pay for these projects? Does the reserve study become a special assessment schedule? You know, a lot of associations I've even seen, we didn't get to this, but just to touch on it, they'll start to partially fund reserves and just kind of build a balance and start to work in that direction. Meaning, if you don't do it at all, which clearly most associations, according to our survey, do not, then you don't have to blow the budget up next year to do that. And we want to be sensitive in these times of COVID as well and be very financially prudent. Gaining community support. Do your online surveys, communicate. Michelle touched upon that. Her teams every day do this with the residents. Make sure we have a good pulse of what they'd like to see, in addition to what we have to do in the building. And that also goes into prioritizing those projects. We will be spending money. The board will be responsible. We'll be spending some money, and therefore we have to do life safety. We have to protect the membership, but of course we also have to give some aesthetic upgrades where we can. We have to give some enhancements to the sustainability of the property and reducing expenses wherever we can from an operating perspective through the projects, and enhancing those property values, because at the end of the day, that's critical to every single owner. Look at the project manager, interview project managers, lean on your team to meet them. Greg is one of our favorites, of course, he's here. But they become an integral part of the team and really given, again, the board at the end of the day, us, of course, as management for sure, but the board at the end of the day, we want you all to feel successful and we want you to be able to sleep at night. And there is some good support that a good project manager will bring to the table. And then, of course, work with your project management company. I think that, again, what we're trying to demonstrate today, at least from my perspective, is look at this team on the screen and visualize that at your community with your project. And at the end of the day, when you as a board and your management team are sitting at the table and you're making your final decisions and you're interviewing contractors and you're voting on contracts, etc., it changes the complete complexity of the conversation with the residents, but also with the contractors. When they see your financial support team, they see your property management team, they see your legal counsel involved and engaged and helping to protect all of us. They see a professional project manager who has done 900 roofs, not just one or two, but roof after roof after roof. Contractors, subcontractors, and the membership will respect that you're protecting them and you're protecting their funds and you're protecting however you're going to pay for these projects. So some of the key takeaways, Greg, real quick.
Yeah, Bill, I failed to answer one question with you, and you brought up engineer acting as project manager, and what that really brings light to is a bigger issue, which is conflict of interest, right? On not necessarily engineer acting as project manager, but just basic conflict of interest on an asset like this. You never want to put yourself as a board member in a position where you might be conflicting with an engineer that is talking about life safety. Put your project manager in that position. They are the expert that can rebut those instances. The other aspect of conflict of interest is typically you never want someone approving their own work, right?
Absolutely.
And what I mean by that is in the restoration scenario is one of the only construction scenarios where I see engineers that are acting as owner rep project managers and approving the workload the work that they have spec on assignment. And if you look at most of the new condos that are being built nowadays, the developers will actually hire a structural engineer that is not associated with the original design, i.e. not the engineer of record, to specifically conflict them out from being a supporting or abutting engineer that comes in with a 558 claim after the fact.
Right, exactly.
So it is in the board's best interests in any and all scenarios that regard, that regard capital improvements, to make sure that there are no conflicts. It's okay for an engineer to act as a project manager, but then he can't necessarily be the engineer of record. Right? Because ultimately, if he is the project manager, he is responsible for the complete budget, hard and soft, and he will be aware of what the open checkbook or spend would be. Some folks may not be happy with me saying that, but unfortunately, it's just a fact. And that is where your conflict on any and all projects, regardless of who it is, engineer or general contractor or otherwise, make sure that there are no conflicts or anything of that sort.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. Just a couple of quick bullet points as we get to questions and answers. Just a little bit about us. The reason we're doing this session today is First Service Residential. If you're one of our associates, you expect this as continuing education, support, and resources. If you're one of our clients, you expect this as an organization who this session today is being broadcast to the Southeast US. And just to put a number around that, we're engaged in over $400 million worth of projects at any given time across the Southeast US. And so trust us, we've been there. We've done that. We've made mistakes and we've fixed them. So we're trying to help provide extra support to our clients through that experience and resources for your benefit. At the end of the day, this is for you, for our client community. So thank you so much. Okay, I'm over time, but I'm going to just try to squeeze in a couple of big questions, folks. Henry, I want to start off with you. I get this question all the time that came through a lot today, and John, need you to chime in as well on this. Our condo got an emergency line of credit. Can we use that for a capital project instead of dipping into reserves? And I think it's important here, emergency line of credit. Gentlemen, can you give us some thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure, Bill. An emergency line is for just that, right? These capital projects, the funding mechanism of a loan is often tapped, but it's a structured loan, and it's actually a lot more favorable to take out a loan with a construction loan, right? That has a draw period, that has a fixed rate. You really want to fund these projects with a mechanism that's designed for doing so. Emergency lines are for that, right? Just for that, for maybe a budget shortfall, or you have an increase in delinquencies in the current situation we're in. You don't want to use those for a capital project expenditure. We've talked about planning the whole session, and the financial planning is part of that. So you don't want to use a mechanism that, that's not intended for a capital project to fund a capital project.
I agree, Bill. I think it's important. I think our entire message today was planning, planning, and planning, not to address a quick hitter fix that that was described by John, that really addresses an emergent need. I think that capital expenditures, I think that long-term maintenance really is defined with funding of a more long-term planned out measure than a quick line of credit.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that. And I think that's part of the financial piece of the business plan, right? What does your financial stack look like? And then really clearly defining that in the plan of each component of that stack and where it should be allocated in writing. Henry and Michelle, are there any projects that do not need a community vote? Henry, you touched on the budget rule earlier between condos and HOAs, but we do, right, Michelle? We get a lot of these questions too that pop up at board meetings. And, in Greg's example earlier, we're going to do an ELSS. That means we have to tear up the hallways. That means we have to replace all the carpet and the paint, but it doesn't exist anymore. Please, if you could just give us some best practices the board members can think about in that regard.
Well,
Well, I
the
think,
Condominium
oh,
Act,
go ahead, Henry.
Condominium Act lists a minimum of elements, Bill, for which reserves are required unless voted not to be funded by a majority of the membership, and that was roof replacement, building painting, and pavement resurfacing. But that list is not all inclusive. The Condominium Act, as well as the Homeowner Association Act, specify that there can be more long-term projects that are subject to reserve financing. So there is no cap on, no preclusion of any other kind of long-term project that otherwise satisfies the expectation that this is going to require a long-term commitment on the part of the association.
So, yeah, that's good guidance, and you know, reviewing those, that's part of the planning process, I think, as well, because we can anticipate in every single project that question coming up. So we have to clearly define that. And Henry, we appreciate your support on that, and Michelle, the best practices there. So as I mentioned, we did run out of time today. There's so much wood to chop around this very critical component of what we do every day. So first, I just want to say thank you to Michelle and to Henry, Greg, and John. What a team. You guys are great, true professionals. Thank you so much for your time and support today. For our attendees today, we still have some questions we need to get to. We will absolutely do that, and we'll get those questions over to the right subject matter expert. Therefore, please feel free to utilize as well the email address on your screen, and we'll screen those questions and get them over to who needs to be the right person to answer them. Again, part of this is not one person is everything. Part of this is putting together the right team. So we want to get you all the right answers and go through some of the additional questions. And then finally, I wish everybody a safe and healthy Thursday and through the rest of the week and the weekend. We'll keep an eye on the tropics. Thank you again for your time and your support. And finally, to the board members out there, thank you for your leadership and your dedication of time and energy. And to the management teams, the associates, for supporting the board and executing on their vision. Thank you all so much. Have a great day and a great weekend, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.